Welcome to the Healer's Café, the number one show for medical practitioners and holistic healers to have heart to heart conversations about their day to day lives while sharing their expertise for improving your health and wellness. Welcome to the Healer's Cafe. And today I have with me Benny Voncken. And he calls himself a Stoic coach. Now we're going to find out what exactly that means very shortly. But he is co-founder via Stoica and the Via Stoica podcast. He also offers Stoic life coaching, corporate training, motivational speaking, and workshops. And his mission is to help people live better lives through the creation and application of a philosophy of life, mainly based on Stoicism. So, all right, let's go. Let's tell us more about what this is, and are we basing ourselves on philosophers? Or welcome anyways, and let's tell us a little bit more about what it is you do.
Yeah, well, and first, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it, and because this is, as I said, as you mentioned, this is one of my missions to kind of help inspire people find their philosophy of life. And
Mhm.
I use Stoicism is my philosophy of life. At least I try to live best I can according to the philosophy. But I'm not, as you know, as we get into Stoic coaching later on, it's not my goal to turn people into Stoics, but really to help them find their philosophy of life and how they live and know themselves more throughout that vehicle. But for me, that's Stoic philosophy really spoke to me, and that's why I've really tried to live my life according to it. But it is difficult, it is a stern and not always easy philosophy to live by. But that's life, right? And we just have to focus on the process, and
Mhm.
that's what I help people with as well.
Okay, and you came across Stoic philosophy in one of your personal turnarounds, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
So,
and
yeah,
this is when I meet most people about when they go to stuff. It's not usually when they are on the top of the mountain screaming like, "Oh, I've made it." It's usually when you meet some obstacles. And for
right,
me, like now looking back at it, that was actually one of the best moments in my life. At the moment itself, it's really difficult and tough. But now
right.
I noticed that that's when I really found myself. And as
Mm,
I was reading more books and I started, I diagnosed myself with an existential crisis. So I picked up a book on existentialism, and the
uh,
Stoics came about in that book, and that's where I found myself on paper. And the more I started reading, it just connected with me. And I think that that's like if you are looking for a philosophy of life, that's the real big sign is like, oh, this really resonates. The words
right.
they use, the methods, the way they look at life, and that's what Stoicism really did to me.
Okay, well, why don't we, or maybe I ask you to make it relevant in the sense of give us a little bit of what you were going through and how the Stoic philosophy related to how it helped you get through it, basically.
Yeah, that's a great moment to start. And for me, I was working as a teacher in Dubai at that moment, and
Mm,
teaching in Dubai isn't the easiest place to teach. So that was like big pressure, and it was
mm,
just difficult mentally. But on top of that, I went through a divorce. The marriage fell apart. I had a pretty severe knee injury, and then after the divorce, all of that, I started drinking again pretty heavily. And that was really the moment when I started to tell myself, like, this is not how I'm going to live my life. When I woke up one morning, hungover, feeling really bad physically, but especially mentally, kind of depressed. And I looked at the mirrors like, this is not going to be me. I've got to make some changes and I've got to be. So I set some rules for myself, not just like to try and live healthy physically, but, with food, but also mentally. And that's when I started taking those steps. And one of as I started looking into philosophy, it really helped me to compartmentalize the things that are happening to me and how I reacted to it. And one of the
right. Okay.
major steps was it that I stopped looking at myself as a victim and saying like, okay, I have agency here. I can actually improve my life from this if I use it the right way.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Okay, so that would be one of the tenets of the philosophy is that you have agency.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's a
Mhm.
really nice thing to see once you realize that you
Right.
actually can do something in with the world.
Right. Like a bit like it's not happening to me, it's happening for me, which
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, which we can look at later, usually not in the moment. But
Yeah.
it's like no way. Um, okay, so what other tenets of Stoicism did you relate to? So that was one of them. What's another example of what
So
helped?
a big one is the dichotomy of control. This is what usually people like when they start to talk about Stoic philosophy is like, okay,
Mhm,
what's about? And it's mainly they start about what's in your control and what isn't. And again,
mhm,
that was something really important that instead of looking outward and trying to change what was happening to me, I really had to learn to accept it. So there's this kind of like radical acceptance, but Nietzsche coined a new phrase that the Stoics, the modern Stoics, have used. It's called
mhm,
amor fati, to really learn to love and embrace your faith. And even someone like Seneca, one of the most famous Stoic writers that at least the texts have survived from a Roman Stoic, he said, you know,
mhm,
you're unfortunate if you've never been unfortunate because you've never had the opportunity to show yourself and the rest of the world what you're capable of. And those kind of things, they showed me, okay, I can do this, but let me focus on what I need to control. And one of the things, for example, was dealing with criticism and dealing with how other people look at me and realizing
mhm,
that that's just their words, that's just their opinions, and I can make it affect me if I choose to, or I can say, let's see what is there any truth behind it. Let's see if there's
mhm.
actually something that can help me. And if not, then I should just learn to let it go. It's again, it's easier to explain this, but doing it is difficult. It takes practice. But I've
Right.
seen throughout the years, like my anxiety levels and my worries have really diminished, have really reduced a lot just by practicing it and just trying to apply it on a
Mhm,
daily
mhm.
basis.
So it's like taking ownership of what is yours and
Yeah,
not what isn't. So and I think, a lot of people have this issue of not liking what's going on, right? And then it's like, well, what of what's not going on do you have direct access and control? And if you don't, then what can you do about your relationship to it, right?
yeah,
I think it's a very big turning point for a lot of people when they work. So for you, it was like what people think of you, which is a common one, right? It's like, are you the tinfoil hatter? Are you the oddball? Are you the, whatever. Like, but you're gonna make different decisions because they are coming. They're they're really about you, and those you control, right? Yeah.
yeah. And that's one of the key points in Stoic philosophy, and some kind of, there's a lot of misconceptions about it. And in the modern view, you have this Broicism, especially in the manosphere, where it just means like to man up and have that stiff upper lip. But
Right.
the Stoics really had like the goal of this of a Stoic life is called eudaimonia, and I roughly translate it as the good spirit state. So they're
Mhm.
really focusing on preserving your character and your soul in the best possible way. That's really what the Stoics are after. And they do that by, being virtuous. They say virtue is the only good, and to live in accordance with nature by using your reason and logic. That's kind of like Stoicism in a nutshell. But
Mhm.
oftentimes people forget about that goal, that it's like, oh, you need to be emotionless, you need to not have all these things affect you. But it's really about things happen to you, and how can you then act in the best morally right way to preserve your character. And that's really what it's about, to make sure that when you die, like they say, to give your character in the best possible way back to the logos, to the universe.
Mhm.
So it
Mhm.
kind of resembles a little bit to like Buddhism, but more like in a
Mhm.
pragmatic
Mhm.
down to earth way. At least that's how I view it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had not seen it that way. And yes, the bias of Stoic has that idea that you're not going to deal with emotions and you're going to, do the English thing, put it under the carpet or, and then stand proudly on top of it without noticing what's happening, right? And I think we have a huge false stoicism as a kind of cultural bias, especially in the male culture. I mean, females too, but they tend to eventually talk,
Yeah.
so.
And it's interesting, like in my journey, I've seen so many more women reach out and talk about it and also feel
Right.
like connected with a philosophy like this. And that
Mhm.
helped me also kind of reshape my view on it because at the beginning you speak to a lot, it's mainly male dominated, but more and
Yeah.
more women start to identify with this as well. And it's really refreshing.
Mhm. So, so, so I'm just trying to really get a handle of the third component. Okay. So the third component of this is where you use the word virtue, it's more like your value system. It's like how, it's not about virtuous. It's really about knowing what you stand for, um, being clear about your right and wrong, or is it God's right and wrong? Like, how far does it go into your inner work and your relationship to some people's relationship to society?
Yeah, and first, like the Stoics are very pro-social. So one of the key things, and what set them apart from their kind of rivaling philosophical school, the Epicureans, was that they said
Right.
like you need to be part of society, right? That's part of your
Mhm,
duty, part of your responsibility.
mhm,
And when
mhm.
we translate the word virtue as they used it, it's more excellence, right? So it's also
Right.
your idea of being the best version of yourself. So whenever you need to show up, you need to
Yeah.
try to be as good as possible, right? Obviously,
Mhm.
again, that's difficult. But to help kind of they divided the four virtues, well, Plato actually did before the
Right.
Stoics and Socrates, into wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage to
Mhm,
kind of help you a little bit in that moment to break it in little parts and see, okay, what is, the wisdom is like knowing what is good and bad. Justice is understanding what is fair to you, but also to the world around you.
mhm, mhm,
Temperance, moderation, and then courage is knowing what is good and bad, and then still doing it, even if it isn't in your
mhm.
aligned with your desires or aligned
Yeah.
with what you really wanted to do. So that's where it kind of really helps you in that moment because again,
Yeah.
they're really focused on the present.
Mhm. Well, that's very interesting. What would you say, because you're counseling other people and organizations, what virtue of the four do you feel? Because one came to me like that's what's missing, but I haven't been in this field as you have. Would you say that there is a core weakness of one of these elements more than others, or they're all, what do you see with people?
Well, for myself, mainly it was like a temperance, but also knowing what is really good and bad to do in the moment. And when I speak to moments, I think nowadays temperance is, living in moderation is very difficult because we're just bombarded with wanting more and all these, the
Mhm,
influences from outside. So it's very difficult to remain in that kind of balance mode. That's at least what I see. But then
mhm,
also justice and how to interact with people. And again, as I said before, like not to have things really affect you too much from the outside, but trying
mhm,
to learn then to interact in the right and just way with others. But I
mhm,
think and there was a French writer. He's passed away now. But Pierre Hadot, he wrote about the three Stoic disciplines, and for
mhm.
me that really captures the practice of Stoic philosophy. And then you can see where people kind of struggle. So you have the discipline of desire, the discipline of assent, and the discipline of action. And that most people struggle with the desire, but assent is a difficult one to
Mhm.
basically that requires you to find the truth of the impressions that you're getting. And I think that that's where kind of people miss now at the moment too. They are not able to interpret the world in a more objective and unbiased way, and
Mhm.
then know how what affects them, and then how not to act and how to act with the right information.
Right. No, that's very interesting. Yeah, the one that occurred to me is courage.
Mm.
Because you see, it's almost like we see enough violence that you have somebody in the street getting punched, or an old little lady and her bag is stolen, and people look and then they look away rather than run and get that person or grab the child that is being taken or whatever the story that you see, right? Like there's there's this kind of like, well, what difference can I make? Or, or oh, it's not my job. Or like we create all kinds of, ideas. But if we're truly in society as active beings, then really it should be our duty in that sense to do something, right? But I think that also the reason it's so weak is is the moral compass is unclear. We like now we're getting, we're hearing about the unbelievable sloth of, what all our people in parliament and, the money laundering, the child trafficking, the forest parties, it's like, what the world is going on? And it's like, I don't know whether it ends up desensitizing or separating us, or, you know, I mean, they will all be arrested. I can only hope. Otherwise, we don't have a moral fiber in our society, right? Which we haven't, because the corruption is so deep. But it's interesting, right? Because yeah, we're not citizens anymore. Like we're not active anymore in the way that it's like a show, and now it is a
Mhm.
show. But it really there's a separation there of your duty to be your best person.
Yeah, and it feels like, we're intentionally being made like fearful to live in that way, or
Right.
being, ashamed of, if we make certain choices. And that's where, as you said rightly, like courage is lacking. And not just when, when something like violence happens, but also in the choices that we make. Like
What would
Exactly.
your life be like if you were pain free? If you were one of the millions who suffer from chronic pain, the thought of just one day without it may seem impossible. This is often because conventional medicine tends to fall short in the treatment of pain, opting to prescribe pills or recommend surgery rather than getting to the root cause of the problem. But if you are suffering with emotional or physical pain, there is hope. Join the founder and CEO of Bowen College, Manon Bolliger, live online for your body-mind reboot. Learn how to listen to your symptoms and get to the root cause of your pain. Plus, be trained in basic Bowen therapy moves so that you can reboot your body for optimal health. You don't have to live in pain. You can heal. Stop the pain pill cycle by visiting www.yourbodymindreboot.com to learn more and to register.
Like
Exactly.
sometimes if I want to have a promotion because I feel that that's what society requires of me to accept a promotion at work, well, I might have to spend far more hours there and lose time with my family or with my loved
Mhm,
ones.
mhm, mhm.
The courageous thing would have been like, no, I'm fine where I am right now because I have other priorities. But then you
Right.
need to know what those priorities are. And we can, relate Stoicism back to Socrates. And Socrates said, like, people don't do bad things willingly. They do them out of ignorance. So if you
Yeah.
see someone
Yeah.
do something bad, it's not because they know that this is bad and they want to do it, because everybody does the right thing to themselves, right? It's a kind of the oikiosis, the self-appropriation, where they
Mhm.
say people do only good things to themselves. But the problem is that most people don't know what the right thing to do is. So that's where we see that unbalance. And then when we talk about, people going to prison or not, at the end of the day, for a Stoic, that's, whether they get a, that kind of punishment, they have corrupted their soul. That's the worst thing that they could have
Right.
done, right? So
Mhm.
there's a story from the Epictetus, who was a slave and became Marcus Aurelius' inspiration. There's some really lovely discourses and a
Mhm.
little like handbook that is there. And he tells about like a lamp was stolen from him that was outside of the house, and he said that person chose to value that lamp such highly that he was able to turn himself into a thief, right? That he corrupted his
Mhm.
character, and the lamp was valuable enough to do so. So, that's the choices that we need to make. And I think if we start to look at the one thing that we need to preserve, then we really are able to make different choices. And that's how we live. And then we can live a
Mm.
peaceful and calm life because our conscious and our soul
Mhm.
is at peace. And that's really what it's. And for me personally, that has shifted like how I look at the world and how I look at myself pretty
Right.
drastically as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was thinking, I mean, this reminds me so much of the in 2020, 2021. When people so-called had the choice. Now, in Canada, choice wasn't really a thing because there was a big confusion that mandate is a law, right? But practice is that for people who live, which is still at least 85% of the people live paycheck to paycheck, 2 weeks at a time, it's not a real choice to choose health over experimentation with health, right? But that's why you need such a top down, and I don't mean you need it positively, that's why it was created to have so much misinformation so that people really didn't know. Like it went against another fundamental belief. Well, authority, like our government wouldn't lie to us, would they? Right? And it's like, oh, and oh, they don't make money, our own, well, I won't give names so that nothing can happen, but, I mean, if you own 40% of every shot of Pfizer, you have an advantage to getting that out, you know. But you see, that lack of transparency and that general belief that people wouldn't do harm and people in charge wouldn't be bad, like all of that, it really went against the instinctual, well, I'm not in the age group where this is a problem. I'm not whatever, whatever, right? Or my children are not, for sure not, right? And I think it's so confusing because you have health, which people do stand behind, but so do they authority that they see as benign, which is not. But you know, it's very interesting, right? Like if you had to make one of those stoic decisions, you'd be in total confusion.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that the Stoics they talk about the impressions, right? The desire of assent that I say that you can assent to impression to say like, oh, this is really happening, and then you investigate the best as possible, or you can reject it like this isn't really happening, and you've investigated and it's truly not happening. For example, if someone is angry at you and you see someone is looking at angry, it's like, oh, this person is angry. Ask him, are you angry? And he says yes. Then you say, okay, my impression was right. But they also
Hmm.
say that in most cases we should withhold, our judgment on these things because simply we don't know, and then it's up to us to try to make the best possible choice that we can make. And but even when we think about a topic like health, and illness, the
Hmm.
Stoics they say that that's a preferred indifference, right? They when
Hmm.
Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, he studied with the Cynics, and they said virtue is the only good, right? Whether you're ill, whether you have nothing, virtue is the only thing you need to live well, to have a good life, right? To preserve your character and your soul. And Zeno said, like, well, I prefer to be healthy, right? But if I'm sick, I can still be a good person. If I'm poor or if I have money, and even Marcus Aurelius said, like, you can live well in a palace because he thought like it's more difficult to live well if you have everything, right? Because then moderation goes out of the door, as many of his
Right, right.
examples, like Nero and Caligula, all
Yeah,
those emperors showed
yeah.
him. But for them, it's like you can still live well. Then I prefer this. This is like my preferred state, and will work towards being healthy. But
Mhm.
if I, for example, with my knee, happened that I was in bed for 6 weeks, and I was iffy if I could ever walk. Some sports I cannot play anymore, and
Mhm.
obviously this is not like a life-threatening disease, but it still kind of had me adjusting my life in a pretty
Yeah.
drastic way. But I remind us like I can still be a good person. This has happened to me.
Mhm.
Fate is
Mhm.
not always online with what we want to happen, but I
Mhm.
can still make the best choice. So even when all these external things happen, and that's where I think we as a society should come together a little bit more instead of standing up against each other, because that's often what I
Correct.
felt is to make the debate and because there were people, when we talk about the 2020 and 21, there were people being afraid, and then we make unrational decisions, and we lose
Yeah.
that discourse with each other where we can all try to learn. Instead of pointing fingers to each other, we can say, okay, let's take a step back here, and let's just, because even, the people in, the medics and the people in government, they had no idea, but they had to make a decision. So I don't know, it is difficult, but what I think is the worst thing there, and is that we lost that connection of trying to find something togetherness. And a second
Mhm.
century Stoic philosopher Hierocles, he created the concentric circles of how things work, right? It starts with the
Mhm.
self, and then you have your family, your close family, your friends, your acquaintances, but then you go to society, to the world, and to the logos, right? The Stoics call themselves cosmopolitans. And they said
Mhm.
you need to try to bring those outer circles in your inner circle. You need to try to see them as your peers, your the same. We're all people at the end of the day, and that's kind of what I think as philosophy of Stoicism can help us to not act out of those emotions, right? They call it the passions, but to take a step back and just kind of like, okay, you know what? I'm struggling, you're struggling. Let's try to figure this out together instead of saying, oh,
Mhm.
you're wrong and you don't know what you're talking about. It's like, okay, I try to empathize with or show compassion with how you feel in that situation. But
Mhm.
and if you make a different choice than me, that's
Mhm.
your at the end of the day, that's your
Yeah.
choice to make.
Yeah. Yeah. But it is kind of an ideal, and I'm not saying it's wrong to have an ideal, but um, but really it didn't come down to that in this society anyways. Like in Canada, if you shared a different point of view, you were censored, or you lost your license, or you weren't allowed to practice, or you didn't have hospital rights, or like I don't think there was a fair playing field for that debate, and that's so important. Like there's so many things in the discussions that are worth discussing. Like that's 100%, right? But it's like you don't even get there because the power structures don't even allow that very simple citizenship. I'll call it right, but it's like, who tells us we can't speak? But then when everyone who has a tongue loses it, well, we know now how it works, you know. So I don't know where the Stoicism, how it works in that way, in that part of, I don't know if I'm making my questions clear enough,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
No, because the Stoics were very big on freedom, right? And they
right.
said like, and a Stoic, this is kind of the famous saying that a Stoic can even experience joy while being tortured, right? Because they know that they're doing the right thing. So
Right.
Stoics look at emotions in twofold. They see the
Mhm.
passions, what they call the bad emotions,
Mhm.
the anger, the sadness, the grief, even like exuberant pleasure, because the reason why they call it bad is because they take you out of a rational state, right? So you
Mhm.
don't want to act out of anger. But they
No.
say the good emotions are joy. Joy is being felt when you act virtuous, right? When you do
Yeah.
the right thing. So even when the world is against you and when you are
Mhm.
maybe put in a corner, you can still be free because no one can
To
control your
change that.
thoughts, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
No one can control that. So even you might not have the outreach that you wanted. For example, Socrates is the best example, right? He
Mhm.
got
Mhm.
sentenced to death because
Right.
he was apparently corrupting the youth of Athens with the philosophy, and he
Mhm.
had his outs, right? People were able to get him out of prison, and if he only just relinquished the philosophy and trying to have these conversations with the people of Athens, then they would forgo his sentence. But he said, no, I can't do that because this is who I am, and if I do so, then I will relinquish who I am. And that's not what I'm
Right.
going to do. So I live in a society and there are people who are in power, and how they get there, that's, maybe a different debate. But
Mhm.
that's also the rules that they set that I've got to live with, but I can still have my freedom within, right? And that's where
Yeah.
that dichotomy of control comes about. It's like, okay, this is happening outside
Mhm.
of my control, but I can still control. And
Yeah.
then maybe you can bring it to smaller circles, to the people that you talk to, or at least live by
Mhm.
the virtues that you set for yourself, or the virtues
Yeah.
and the values, I mean, the priorities. and then you can still live that good life, even though the rest of the world is trying to make it as difficult as possible. You can still do the right thing.
Yeah, for yourself. Yeah. No, no, I that's true of the people who could, and I think it's very in such a sophisticated propaganda and with a high level of lack of knowledge, like and not the ability to truly share knowledge. Um, it's interesting. This whole debate becomes very important, right? Because so many people are saying, well, I had no choice. And it's like, well, you did, but the choice would have been not feeding your family. Now, what kind of choice is that, right? So it's like, some people say, well, I had to travel. Okay, that's a choice. But, and then some people travel because that's their job. Others need it because, again, there's a whole spectrum, right? And some people see the freedom in traveling, and that's what mattered more than health. That's then a decision I wouldn't make, but it's a virtue decision if you believe that, So it's interesting. It's a very muddy. We're going to have it's going to take a lot of years to sort this out internally to find that peace, especially I think as parents. I run a few groups that they did it for school purposes and things like that, and it's like, what is their responsibility, how do you live with yourself with this level of trickery, like it's really anyway, but it's time for these conversations. So that's why I was
Yeah.
really looking forward for our discussion today, because
And but this
yeah,
also happens on many other levels, right? If you have to make a decision about where to work and if you're going to work for such a company, or if you
correct.
make other decisions in life. And I think that that's where people forget that they are responsible for their own actions and for what
That's
they
right.
do. And sometimes we also have to be honest, like we're human beings and we're going to make mistakes, right? And
Yeah.
this is one of the things that Stoic philosophy gets criticized a lot, because they have the bar really high. They say like you want to work towards being the perfect person, but they really focus on making progress. And they say like,
Right.
okay, if you made a mistake, learn from it, turn it into
Mhm.
knowledge, turn it into something that you can help you for the next
Mhm.
time around, and then you might make different decisions, because all of that experience will help you to get to know yourself. And
Mhm.
and then it's also time to show compassion to yourself and to others, right? Because when
Correct.
people make mistakes, it's like, hey, what have we learned here? Instead of pointing the finger, we can say, okay, let's come together and let's try to kind of figure this out, especially when times are confusing, and they are. We don't know what's going on, like even in the person next to us. Even if they tell us, there might still be a lot of different things going on, or in our society.
Yeah.
But the Stoics also are clear, like we live in a society, and if the rules are there, then we either learn them and try to work as best with them, or accept them just as the laws of nature. Sometimes nature can set the
Mhm.
hardest boundaries on our life, and still
Mhm.
we need to try to learn and live with them.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, Benny, we're at the end of our our time. Do you have a few last words, and maybe how do people get hold of you? It'll all be put on the website, but just for those who are purely listening.
Yeah, no, I would love to encourage people to find their philosophy of life and to set their values and priorities, and to try to really live that good life from an internal perspective with, connection with everybody around them. And if they do want to learn out more, they can go to viastoica.com. That's the website, and there's pretty much all the information there. And also the podcast is on YouTube. It's Via Stoica. That's pretty much all you need to look for online, and you can find me on all the socials and everywhere there. And then you can get in touch as well. My emails and everything is out there as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for sharing your enthusiasm and purpose, life purpose.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. It was a great conversation. It went by fast. No, it was
Yes,
great.
I
Yeah.
know. Thank you for joining us at the Healers Cafe. If you haven't already done so, please like, comment, and subscribe with notifications on, as I post a new podcast every Wednesday with tons of useful information and tips for natural healing that you won't want to miss.